I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone joke they want their last check to bounce to the undertaker. And as amusing as it would be to see this sort of long con play out to the gravedigger, it raises an interesting question. How hard is it to actually and comfortably die with zero? I wanted to explore this idea, and that's exactly what we're going to do in this video. We'll take a look at an example and see if we can come up with a practical answer. Hey everybody, I'm Curtis Crossland of Subtle Crossland Wealth Advisors. I help folks build more tax-efficient retirements, so let's get into this. Now I want to keep this fairly simple and straightforward because in my experience, trying to spend down to your last penny the day before you die is insanely difficult. And when you consider that a lot of people are going to have different goals, different needs, different twists and turns of life, there's almost a limitless number of possibilities that are going to play out over the decades. But it got me thinking, and the reason that I want to look at this is to try to answer the question, how hard is it to actually do this? So I'll put up on the screen just a list of assumptions here. We're looking at a married couple, ages 73 and 70. We're going to say that they're going to die at age 90. We're also going to say that they have no current debt, but they do want to be snowbirds and buy a vacation home, so they'll end up having a little bit of debt as part of that purchase. We're also going to say that they do have some income sources, but they do have much higher expenses than regular. So it's not like they have a pension or some combination that's going to provide enough regular income. They're going to have to live off of and use their investments. We're also going to say that they're not supporting any kids or grandkids currently, so they really don't have any other considerations right now to support other family, which would be an added cost. We are going to say that they budget for some leisure, and we're going to add costs for things like additional medical expenses in retirement and end-of-life care as part of the review. So you can start to see that even when simplifying it, there's going to be a number of variables that have to be considered, and then one person may need something, the other is not. There's no guarantee that somebody's going to need end-of-life care, nursing, or otherwise. Somebody may need that, and so you do have to try to account for things like that. And consider that if any one of these things changes within the next 5, 10, 15 years, that can really throw things off. Now, you can also see a little bit about their financial situation currently. We've got a net worth of about $3 million, so a lot of assets to work with here. And we'll take a look in a minute at things like their income versus expenses and a couple other items just to get an idea of what we're working with. Now, how exactly do I plan to look at this? Well, I'm going to look in two ways. The first is going to be to use a Monte Carlo. And the second is going to be a more linear look using fixed assumptions on average returns, inflation, things like that. And the other issue is you can actually get different results, whether you're looking at the Monte Carlo or just a linear set of assumptions. And something like this can also further complicate trying to do this. So let's go take a look at the cash flows and get an idea again of the income sources, how much is coming in, as well as the expenses. And this is going to give us an idea of what their situation in particular looks like. So looking at income flows, we see Social Security, we see a little bit of pension, a little bit of annuity, and we end up having this total income flow of right around about $55,000, at least initially. And then if we take a look, if we go back and look at their expense total, we can see that their total outflows are going to be about $157,000 from this number here. So that's a pretty big difference between what they're going to have from some income sources and what they're going to have for expenses. And this tells us that we are going to have to use the investment account. So this is going to be, I think, a good example to look at. Now, I said as well, I'm going to take a look at the Monte Carlo as part of this. So let me pull that up. And when we take a look at their current plan, they obviously have a very high probability of success. And we can also see that they actually have a pretty high median of ending balance within their accounts. But if we dig just a bit deeper and actually look at how this Monte Carlo is going to show these assets play out over time, you actually start to see quite a bit of dispersion the further out we go. So things are pretty tight here. But as we come out about 20 or 30 years, you can see that the probability of what their portfolio might do really widens. And now's a good time to do a quick breakdown on a Monte Carlo, just in case you haven't been introduced to this tool before, or if you just want a refresher. So I'm going to put a couple definitions up on the screen. But a Monte Carlo simulation involves the use of a computer to represent the operation of a complex financial system. A characteristic feature of a Monte Carlo simulation is the generation of a large number of random samples from specified probability distributions to represent the operation of risk in the system. Monte Carlo simulation is used in planning, in financial risk management, and in valuing complex securities. Monte Carlo simulation is a complement to analytical methods, but provides only statistical estimates, not exact results.
And so this definition comes from the CFA Institute, but this does a good job of kind of explaining technically what the Monte Carlo does. The way that you would just think about it is there's a lot of variables to how you live your life, how you conduct your finances. There's a lot of variation to how that can actually play out over time. And the idea is to have a tool that can show us the probability of any of these random outcomes happening. But this chart is often referred to as a hurricane path because while it can't tell you exactly where you're going to end up, it can provide a relatively high probability of a range of outcomes. So now the fun part, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to get that median line or that dark blue line in the middle here. I'm going to try to get that line to 0 by age 93. And the reason 93 is showing up here is because in the example, Yoda is 3 years older than his wife. And let me just put any concerns to bed. Yes, I am a sci-fi nerd. So we're using Yoda in our example here, assuming he's only 73 living to 90. So 93 because this means his wife goes to 90. So what do we actually need to do to get that median line to 0? Well, we have to increase spending. If we want to spend down and hit 0, the idea is the money in the account has to go away. So while we're not going to pick and choose exactly how we're going to spend that money, what we can do is just simply assume that we're going to have a higher monthly expense in retirement. You fill in the blanks on what you would want to spend that on or what they would spend it on. But the idea is, at what point do we have to raise the spending to until we hit 0 on that median line? So let's take a look. So we're starting out at 6,000. And what we'll do is we will just fill in, I don't know, let's just double it and say 12,000 a month up from 6,000. If that's the only thing that we change, we still see that our median line is well above 0 even when we get all the way to the end of life here. Now, something to note is that the bottom line or the 5% level actually hits 0 well before end of life. And now you're starting to see some of the difficulty of actually trying to get to 0 before you pass away, and that has a lot to do with tail risk. All right, so we actually need to do a little bit more. Let's go ahead and we'll do 15,000 instead of the 12,000, and we'll see how that shapes up for us here. So now we can actually see that our median line hit 0 well before the end of life assumption. And if we come back over here and look at the probability, this thing zeroes out. So this just means I overshot the mark a little bit here. Let's change this instead. We'll go 14,000. And we may have nailed it. So our median line looks like it's going to hit 0 right at the end of life. But notice something else here. The dispersion actually increased. So the probability of outcome is still somewhere between that 5 and 95% on the path that those assets can take. But you'll notice it widened. And that also doesn't bode well for the negative side of things, that tail risk, or what is the probability of the kind of the worst case scenarios playing out. Theoretically, you could see yourself running out of money even sooner if all the wrong things happen to you. And who can predict those? So if I was in Yoda's shoes here and I was trying to hit 0 by end of life, I would have to take on an increase in the variability of what my portfolio might do over the years. And I really don't know if that's a good trade-off. So this is everything goes perfectly according to plan, but what happens if we have even one random event? So I'm going to actually go and build in real quickly one expense 10 years from now. Let's say one of them ends up in the hospital, has a large bill that can't be covered by insurance, has to come out of pocket. But let's see what one unexpected life event cost may do to them 10 years down the line, changing nothing else. So over here, I've actually added in a single unexpected life event cost. We said 100,000. We're going to say it's a hospital related expense. And we're going to say that this is just something that couldn't be covered by any of the health insurances. And this is something that has to come out of pocket for them. So let's go take a look and see what happens to our median line when we come back. Again, this is the only thing that we changed. You can actually see, it's hard to tell, but it does look like the median line starts to hit a little bit before age 93. And the other thing you'll notice is that the dispersion, it seems like it may have gotten a little bit wider as well. And it does look like our tail risk, or that risk of the worst possible outcome, is actually nudging closer to age 83. So this shows you the risk of trying to do something like this, because if you have one or more life events, expenses you didn't plan for, anything like that, this can really start to throw a wrench into the idea of landing at 0, or the difficulty in trying to land at 0, especially using something like a Monte Carlo, which again does highlight how different any of these outcomes can be. Now, I am going to come up here and I'm going to get rid of the hospital expense, because what I want to do especially if we come back here and we take a look at that median line again. Great, we're still hitting right about 0 at age 93. Now let's take a look at the linear. Now to actually look at the linear, I'm going to come up here to cash flows, and we're going to look at the ending balance by accounts on more of that linear view. So remember, the linear view is going to account for things like cost of living increase, inflation, and other assumptions, but it's not going to be running random probability and trying to give us that probability of outcome like we saw in the Monte Carlo. So what I'm curious about first is, without changing anything else, when we had that Monte Carlo go down to 0, or roughly have that median line hit 0 by end of life, what does that look like on the linear view without changing anything? So if I scroll down, so we can see here that we actually do have several $100,000 left in accounts by the time that we hit end of life, whereas with the Monte Carlo, we were hitting that 0 point on the median line. So what does this mean? Well, this means that the linear view is giving us a little bit more of a favorable outcome compared to the median line of the Monte Carlo. And so we just need to go and change some of the spending assumptions in order to try to get ourselves to that 0 balance by the end of life. So I'm just going to come back here and I'm going to put in 15,000. And I want to see what that does when we come back and we take a look at that ending balance. So look at that. We end up hitting 0, going up $1,000 more. So instead of $14,000 per month spending compared to the original $6,000. So $15,000 appears to be about the magic number in this particular review. And that number, again, it was higher than the Monte Carlo. And we looked at a number that was significantly higher than a Monte Carlo that had a high probability of outcome. So now the other thing that we need to do is I want to take a look at adding back in that one off-track, unexpected $100,000 hospital expense 10 years from now. And I want to see what that does to the ending balance of accounts. All right, so here we go. I've added back in that $100,000 hospital. If we take a look 10 years from now, let's go and take a look and see what happens to that end of balance number now that we've added in a single large unexpected expense. So we're still hitting 0 by age 90, but again, the question is, does that money run out to the undertaker, or did it run out, the first day of turning 90 for Yoda's wife here? So again, the unexpected things that are hard to know, those curveballs life throws you, life events as I've referred to it, can really change how things can play out on this. So imagine you're at a position in your life where you're looking at maybe a 20 or 30-year retirement. How on earth are you going to try to plan 0 to the undertaker when you can have all of this variability? So an interesting decision to somebody that was actually trying to do this would be, well, should I use a Monte Carlo? Should I use a linear view? Do I look at both and split the difference? Well, realistically, you'd probably use the Monte Carlo because it's at least attempting to account for random possibilities. And this right here highlights the current approach to financial planning. You're essentially building an asset base that you'll likely never outspend. And this is in an effort to avoid the possibility of random events, market activity, something knocking you all the way back to 0 unexpectedly before you die, because those are all very real possible outcomes. Now, somebody might be thinking, well, aren't there people that have only pensions? Maybe they have, some combination of pension and Social Security, and maybe that income. So instead of being in the situation like we see for Yoda here, maybe their situation is they have ample income to cover expenses, and that maybe projects to be the case through their life. But if they have no reserves, aren't they on a path to die with 0? Well, probably, but I would argue that unless you're in that situation already, it's not exactly ideal. Building a reserve and having something for emergencies or unplanned changes in life or health spending, even with large and stable incomes, should be a priority, because you just cannot predict how life will change on you and all the uncertainty that can come with that. So even something like Social Security that's basically guaranteed by the US government, well, who's to say that doesn't change in some way, shape, or form to be able to provide off into the future? Or who's to say that a pension, even a pension from a very reputable company, doesn't have some issue with insolvency, and then insurance has to step in, and you're not exactly made whole if a pension goes bankrupt. Bottom line, from my point of view, is this is still virtually impossible. It's very fun to think about and it's fun to look at, but it really just invites way too much tail risk to really consider something like this. And in my experience, people in retirement tend to emotionally feel the decrease in investment accounts in a very different way than at any other stage of life. And this type of, I'll call it loss aversion, really is a powerful factor in decision making. I think it'd be a really laid back and carefree person that would try to spend everything down and just go with the flow if they ended up having all of these negative scenarios where they ran out early and were able to make, monumental adjustments in their finances without a care in the world. It would take a very unique individual to do that and then have that last check bounce to the funeral home. But that's just not something that you see with people by and large. Trying to bounce your last check to the undertaker is incredibly, incredibly long odds just because of the unsure nature of how things are going to occur as time progresses. Once more, I'm Curtis Crossland, and if you enjoyed this video, I would certainly appreciate a subscribe. And if you want to see how we help folks build a more tax-focused and efficient retirement, be sure to check us out at www.subtlecrossland.com.